Okay, testing 1, 2, 3. All right. Hello, everybody. Today we're going to continue talking about what happens when one side plays the Mujannah, probably white in most cases, and the other side plays a Sheik opening. This is a game that I played against Phil Harris. I had the black pieces, and Phil began with very kind of aggressive, classical form of the Mujannah. Uh, Thinking about his move order, he's opening with c4 and f4 immediately. As I've mentioned many times in my other lectures, typically in Mujannah today, white's going to play a4 pawns, advancing all of his pawns up, and then will more cautiously strike to one side or the other. Sensing that white has played, white's invested a lot of time in an aggressive Mujannah, I hit in the center immediately with d5. And I think it's interesting to see what Phil played here. Phil actually played c takes d5 immediately, which is a move I'm not crazy about for white. One move that I see a lot here would be d3, but I think the problem with this move order for white, I mean, it's not really a problem, but if white is trying to get a classical Mujannah setup, with this very aggressive early form of that, black can disrupt it by exchanging, then bringing the elephant out to a6, where it hits the c4 point. White is going to have to lose the tempo on something like b3. Black will play knight to d7. And we'll probably see something like, knight to c3, king to c7. The rook's coming over to d8, and the king's a little unsafe, so white's going to have to choose something to do with his king here, probably something like king to c2. And, I don't think black's position is anything too special, but it's disruptive for white if white is trying to get a very classical Mujannah, because at some point black's probably going to make this elephant sacrifice, bring the knight to b6, put some pressure on the pawn on c4. Black also has the e5 break, which is very annoying for white to deal with, I think, because if white were to exchange pawns, then black is going to be doing great. I mean, black will be able to get his own knight out, knight g to f6, and both sides are going to have an isolated Fursan pawn in the center, isolated e pawn. It's not really clear that the strategies that are being followed here are anything like what white is aiming for in a Mujannah. So certainly there's no blazing Shah side attack. White's control of the center is going to be contested. Black has very easy developing moves. This elephant can come out either way. Black's knight can come out. Fursan has a good square. This knight can come out here. So I find these positions to be fairly easy to play for black, and I don't really see an easy way for white to get much of an edge. White certainly has a space advantage in those kinds of positions, and there's various things he can try to do, but I think the move d3 gives black this chance to really mix things up. So most Mujannah players aren't going to like that, and I think that's why Phil opted for c takes d5 in this game. Now, if I have this position with white and I'm trying to play for Mujannah, the move of choice here is definitely going to be b3. The reason for this is, okay, if black goes after the same line with bishop to a6, white's going to play d3. And, if black wants to continue to mix things up and not allow white to just consolidate and get actually a fairly typical Mujannah structure in this kind of Mujannah versus Sheik opening. Not saying this is a good move, but if black wants to continue to mix things up, he's going to have to play the elephant sack. Something like this to really mix things up and try to destroy white's game. Um, so black would then play knight to d7, and knight's coming out to b6. But I think white actually should get an advantage here. I think the elephant sack is premature, not because elephants are worth anything. I've said many times elephants are completely worthless, but actually because this b file looks kind of nice for white. So after something like knight to b6, rook to b1 is entirely possible. King to c7 to guard the b7 pawn. And here, probably not c5 because black will play knight to d5, creating a lot of problems for white. And well, the c5 pawn is going to be surrounded here. Black can take either way and should have a big edge. But white can just continue with knight to d2, guarding the c4 pawn. Black plays rook to d8, pinning. White has to step his king off, so it's to defend the c4 pawn again. And here I feel like the elephant sack has been a little bit too early. White should focus on developing his pieces. Probably, e3, maybe get an elephant out. Farzan should come out. If it's necessary due to some break played by black in the center, g3 is possible. And long-term, white's goal is going to be to put pressure on the Shah side, maybe with something like a very slow march of the a pawn to a5. And it's not clear that black has any really good way to continue attacking the c4 pawn. I could be completely wrong about all this because, all right, well, there's a rook coming in to d4, but let's see. So if black were to play rook to d4, white can just meet it with e3. Yeah, so there's not really any kind of cheap shot for black that starts picking things off immediately. Black is going to have to play slow here. Maybe knight h6 with the idea of coming in, to f7 and then to d6 eventually. But, all right, so if something like knight to h6, threatening to come into f5, white's probably going to play bishop d3 to stop that. It's, and we just have a game here, but my inkling is that white's pressure on the Shah side gives him a pretty good game, and black is not necessarily, loving the fact that he gave up that elephant so early. There's not any kind of dramatic counterplay. So I think in this position, I think the move b3 works for white. I think you should play it. And d takes c4 is probably not the most accurate move. It's possible, here that a move like bishop to a6 is a way to try to keep up some pressure, but then white will just play d3. So it's not clear that black has been able to do anything special to take advantage of white's move order. So, while I've said many times most players will prefer a 4 pawns to get into the Muj, just because it requires a lot less accuracy and you don't have to be paying attention to all of these subtle move order tricks. There's nothing wrong with playing for a Mujannah this way, and after d5, b3 was probably the move. But okay, Phil played c takes d5, and this is going into the structure that we've discussed in my big lecture on what Al-Alaj had to say about the Sheik versus the Muj, which is a structure where white is going to play c takes d5, and he's going to play f takes e5 and open both the c and the f files. So, all right. So Phil plays pawn to e3. I just continue development. Knight to c3 comes. Knight gd7. This d5 pawn has to be supported if black is ever going to get the e5 break in. White played pawn to d3, and here, you know, when I'm reflecting on this, I really kind of jumped the gun with pawn to e5 immediately. If you notice, I only spent 3 seconds on this move. I just blitzed it out. And if I were playing this position now, I would not be trigger happy to play e5. There's no reason for black to rush it. Black can play Ferdinand f7. He can play the bishop to d6, where it kind of tickles this f4 pawn. He can play pawn to a6 to stop any knight to b5 tricks. He can play pawn to b6 to stop any elephant tricks. There's really kind of a nice way that black should probably be playing slow and just building up this position. Because there's no need to rush the move e5. What's white going to do? So, like, let's say that black plays Ferdinand f7. Well, if white plays pawn to d4, I mean, this is just ugly. It's going to create holes. Sure, maybe it stops the e5 push, but black has some chances of running a Ferdinand in. Even if white stops it all by playing bishop to d3, the problem for white here is, you know, this is just going to be a big hole. At some point, black's going to stick a knight on it. It could be after this elephant leaves and the knight gets rerouted. If white were to exchange this off, black is going to have a very good pawn structure where he'll be able to try to come in the deep end game. He'll come in on the light squares with his Ferdinand. White's Ferdinand is not going to be nearly so good in the end game. So, you know, a move like d4 just is going to violate some basic principles. Fixing all of the pawns on the same color as the Ferdinand when white really doesn't realistically have a chance of getting an e5 break, which would sort of further the options for getting this Ferdinand in deep on the Ferdinand side. d4 isn't going to be a problem. If white tries to play e4, black is not going to be afraid of this either. The pawn on f4 is just going to be a big weakness. So just something like bishop to h6, white will play pawn to g3. Black will just simply continue developing, probably not afraid of this exchange in the center. You know, it's also entirely possible, maybe even from this position, there's something like an exchange followed by an e5 break. Not entirely convinced, but it does help that black is actually ahead on development here. Black has 4 pieces out, white only has 2. That's because white has invested so much time. And this can happen when white plays a very aggressive form of the Mujannah. White invests a lot of time in that, so black can often be ahead in development, even, you know, as far as move 10, move 12. So this kind of structure, putting pressure on the f4 pawn, this might even be good for black. But certainly there's no problem with just, you know, continuing the development on this side of the board and, you know, figuring out, does this, you know, do we need to play the pawns over? Does the king need to run out of the center? Um, doesn't feel like white's really getting anywhere. Plus, white also has to calculate the elephant sacrifice. It probably doesn't work here because of the pawn on d5. I don't know, maybe this gets thrown in. Maybe there's something. It's a little, it's uncomfortable on this pawn. Maybe white has to defend with knight to e2. Here, black has an option to put his king on e7, throw the rook over with check. The white king is a little uncomfortable since it can't go to e2. So there's a lot of things that white is going to have to calculate here. These are things that are going to make his life uncomfortable, and black is going to have a lot of resources. So there was no reason for me to rush pawn to e5. It would have been better to just play the position without this immediately. And why not play pawn to e5? Well, in this position, black has the chance to be ahead in development. Black has 2 knights out, white has 2 knights out. Any old move, bishop to h6, whatever, bishop to d6, is going to give black a little bit of a lead in development, and black gives that up here. And white could have, in this position, probably just immediately played pawn to e4. The problem for black is that, okay, if I were to go pawn to d4, now this knight comes in. Black obviously can't take because the e5 pawn falls. Well, maybe black can take. Maybe there's some tricks, but black's falling behind in development to get all this done, and he's not really getting anything special. So, I probably wouldn't take. I'd probably play something else, maybe try to run the first hand up. But it seems like white is already starting to get some strong play, and this structure for white, if white can avoid being cramped on space, is as we've seen in some of the past lectures, not disadvantageous for white. White can maybe at some point, run an elephant up, has some chances. So Phil played bishop h3, which is fine. And here, I played pawn to h6. The idea is to stop any knight g5 funny business, but I really am falling behind in development here, and I didn't really think about that fact. Yet again, if I were white now, playing this game today, if I had the white pieces, probably start playing pawn to e4. This is a great outpost for the elephant. h6 wasn't really focused on development. And after pawn to d4, probably just jump in with knight d5. It's probably to white's advantage if a pair of knights come off the board, because this structure is a little bit cramped anyway. So go ahead and relieve that cramp, and then white will have some good play along the f file and along the c file. So pawn to h6, if I had to play it again, probably just start with a first hand. There's not really anything to be afraid of. If knight g5, I just come here because, the elephant guards everything. So, pawn to h6, I think part of the reason that I played this way is that I've played Phil before, and I thought that I knew what he was going to do. And it turns out that I was right. What actually happens in this game, I play pawn to a6. Again, don't really like this. I'm losing way too much time. White should break with e4. Bishop to a3 was played. Pawn to b6. I'm just stopping any funny business. Rook to c1. this is a good move, just normal. I played bishop to e6. Well, I'll tell you this. This is probably not a great move. And I'll show you in the next game that I look at how I improved on this. Black should be playing probably to put the rook on c7. The bishop should be left on c8 for defensive purposes, and black should just run the Fursan up to e6 in order to hold together the center, and develop the Fursan. Always have an eye on f7, which is kind of a weak point that white can try to penetrate to. So yeah, for black here, probably Fursan to f7 is the right move. Maybe depending on any move order tricks, maybe rook to a7, and then black should just try to put his rook on c7 to neutralize white's play a bit. But I played bishop to e6. The logic at the time was, oh well, my elephant is restricted. I've played this a6 move, so I have to put it on e6 so that it will do something, and I can put a rook on c8. But the problem is, if the elephant is the one to come to e6 rather than the Fursan, then the Fursan ends up coming to the d7 square. And if that happens, then f7 is weak, and white can penetrate there with a rook. So, and of course, if the Fursan runs out this way, then white is always going to have discovered attacks on it with a knight, and those aren't any fun either. The Fursan doesn't really have any future on f7. It can go out this way, but that's kind of a long shot if anything's happening in the center. So bishop d6, not a great move, but here my luck in this game sort of restarted. White played rook to c2. So white is beginning a plan that's seen a lot at at the club level, if you will, in Shatranj. Very common plan. White's just going to double rooks, try to trade rooks, and make a draw. I see it a lot. But as we know from having looked at Alalaj's ideas, this is actually probably the time for white to be ambitious. White shouldn't be draw obsessed. Just because black has a nice space advantage from having played the Sheik, has a nice advantage in the center. If we actually kind of were to count how the players are doing on development, white is way ahead on development, which means that white needs to strike in the center with e4. Black pushes with d4, which is probably the best move. Now white jumps in, knight to d5. This exchange isn't possible given the fork and the pressure on e5, so black has to find some other move. Possibly. Well, the problem is the b6 pawn is hanging. Yeah, b6 pawn is hanging here because white is going to play knight takes b6, black plays rook b8, but the knight just comes back, guards the square, rook to b4, runs into b3. So black has to find a way to deal with the fact that the b pawn's hanging. Nobody's going to be crazy about the move pawn to b5. It's just going to create a ton of weaknesses on c5. It's possible that bishop to c5, hitting this, drive the defender away. Maybe this is the best move. And after the knight goes to g6, this is going to be weak. Also possible that just sticking the rook into c5 is the best move. this looks very, very hard for black to meet because white's going to exchange knights, and then he's going to grab the pawn on e5. Um, I don't see a way out of that. Certainly not just looking at the board here. Black's very, uh, yeah, black looks to be in huge, huge trouble here. So rook to b8 to try to hold this pawn is the move. Um, and here we can assess different approaches for white. White basically should choose, okay, do I want to double on the C file or do I want to double on the F file? The advantage to doubling on the F file is, okay, this bishop is on E6 and the furzen's probably going to come to D7, so white can penetrate. The advantage to doubling on the C file is just that this pressure is concretely hitting the knight on C6, and with a knight on D5 hitting a defender, there's already maybe a ton of problems. I haven't analyzed this deeply enough to know which one is better, but my impression just looking at it is after rook f2, black's in a lot of trouble. If black just sort of plays a typical slow move g6 with the idea, maybe this rook is going to come over to defend some of these weaknesses along the back rank. Well, there's tactics already. Knight takes e7, takes, and knight takes e5. This looks bad. King takes e7, of course, would just run into rook takes e6. So slow move isn't possible. E5 pawn's attacked. Well, yeah, actually looking at it from this position, white can just do this immediately. So yeah, so this is actually, this is worse for black than I thought. Knight comes into d5, huge pressure. So yeah, rook to b8, knight takes e7, and e5 pawn falls. So okay, so pawn to e4, black isn't going to be able to meet it with knight to d5. Probably this means black has to exchange. Okay, but then white plays d takes, and ostensibly, the pawn structure is symmetrical, which everybody tends to think means that it's going to be drawn. But look at white's huge lead in development in terms of already having two rooks mobilized, and black doesn't have anything like that. So, I'll just show you one quick thing. Let's say that black plays king to c7, trying to get the rook over to d8, which seems logical. Well, probably just yeah, knight to d5 check again. The problems for black here, well, okay, if the king comes over, maybe white exchanges and just grabs the free pawn on e5. That, certainly looks like a free pawn. Might not be winning, but it's free pawn. And then, okay, well, let's say that black plays this, then pins the pawn, hoping to just win the pawn, pin it to win it, they say. But rook takes c6. So this doesn't work for black. So yeah, so black is going to have to play very, very precisely to defend this. And actually, if we see, I'm lagging by a minute on the clock here. It looks like what happened is around this minute, I started to maybe panic a little bit. I should have found this rook left that just holds everything together, and I just ignore trying to develop the bishop, and then I can put my Furzian in. But for whatever reason, I thought for 35 seconds and launched this guy into e6, and but yeah, now pawn to e4 is really going to cause me some headaches. Um, but I had some good luck here, and Phil played in the manner that I expected him to, which was rook to c2, just with the idea of doubling. Um, often players who play this way, they just want to leave all of their pawns here in these rather passive positions, and they're not willing to do what Alalaj said was best and to break with e4. Um, so again, I play rook to c8, and okay, all right, bishop to c1. The idea with this is, I think, probably just White's worried about knight to b4 at some point. Really, what White's doing is White's building a fortress. White's going to build a fortress with these pawns, so I can't do anything on the Shah side. Uh, bishop to c1, it's not a bad move, but and I've managed to consolidate. So now e4, probably e4 is still best, but it's not such a big deal because I at least have some ability to make exchanges along the c file, and black should probably equalize. But after bishop to c1, this is where black starts to get a little more confidence in his game. If black survives to the end game, then the idea is having a lot more space is going to give black the chance to play for some kind of a squeeze. So bishop to d6, all right, pawn to a3, just covering b4. Fine moves, rook to f8, rook c to f2, king to c7, knight to d2. So White has achieved his aim, and I wasn't crazy about this because now I'm kind of tied to defending these squares. So I went ahead and allowed all the rooks to come off the board. Okay, and then White plays king d2. Okay, so this is really the structure that I want to talk about. This tabia in the minor piece endgames comes up a lot in Shatranj. On the Internet Chess Club back in the early 2000s, when I was playing there, this setup where one side had two pawns in the center and the other side had two pawns only advance one square, and these C and F files were open. This came up in over half of the games when we were playing on ICC. Now, I think we've progressed a lot since then, and there are a lot of new ideas, a lot of fresh ideas. So I would say that this, maybe this is something that comes up for me, once in every 10 games or so, rather than being something that comes up in half of the games. Nevertheless, it's very important. So what are Black's main ideas? Well, in terms of piece placement, king to d6, this is what you really want. You really want this king to be in the center. The black king is going to be up here defending the d5 and e5 pawns. Black is going to try to make space on this side of the board, and black is going to try to make space on this side of the board. There's some question as to where is black actually going to penetrate in order to try to make a win. I think the answer is whichever side White botches the most in terms of pawn structure and creating weaknesses. What does White want to do? Well, honestly, White probably would like to play pawn to e4 at some moment. But a lot of players are going to be hesitant to play the move pawn to e4, even though it's very helpful in terms of just gaining space, uh, in a position where black is going to be able to play knight to d4 and create an outpost there, a lot of white players are going to hesitate to play it. The other thing is with the king on d6, the move d4 suddenly becomes very strong. The idea is with the king on d6, the knight to d5 isn't possible because after this exchange, black is just going to win the pawn. So this is a very important reason to have the king on d6. If white were to play pawn to e4 here, I'd want to calculate both pawn to d4 and knight to c4 check as different options. I like pawn to d4. This knight is going to be forced to move. It's going to go out of the game. And what black is going to hope to do here long term is advance on both sides of the board and hope to crack the b3 square as an eventual weakness. So in terms of the long-term plan, black's going to play something like pawn to b5. The idea is this pawn's going to come to a5. Well, and the pawn's going to come to a4. The pawn's going to come to b4. The black king is going to come up to c5. And then this elephant is going to come into d6 to try to support the b4 pawn. And black's going to try to cram something down on this structure. It's also possible in this position. It's possible to try to run a pawn up to a4 first so that the king can sit on b5. This comes up sometimes, but personally, I usually don't succeed with trying to actually push into the position with the king sitting on b5. So if I were to get this position over the board, probably wouldn't play king to c5 right away because, okay, knight to b3 check, king here. Kind of feels like I'm wasting time, although, the king is coming in to potential square. White can go back maybe. King comes up, pawn to b3 check, maybe just holding everything. So probably wouldn't play king to c5 right away. I'd probably play b5. Another possibility would be to try to expand on the Fursian side. You always want to be looking for a chance to play something like this with black, getting the knight into f4. If you force white to play g3, this can be somewhat advantageous in that it limits the mobility of this Fursian. It really gets hampered in. And the pawn certainly isn't going any further. It's not coming up to g4 because the elephant hits it. So sometimes the move knight to g6 to try to invoke or try to provoke a weakness can be helpful. But probably I would lead with pawn to b5, thinking about the position. What kind of looks strongest to me here. Another important theme, these pawn to b5 scenarios, let's say the white plays pawn to b3, black probably is going to play pawn to a5 just to keep space, try to keep kind of a clamp on things. Black has a noteworthy plan of playing knight to d8, knight to b7, and then the knight into c5. And the idea is going to be kind of to hit these two potentially weak pawns. If white plays pawn to a4, then this knight might be able to hop in even further. So quite a big knight hop. The knight on c5 can be very useful. Sometimes black will have the idea of playing pawn to a4. White takes, the knight will grab it and come into the c3 square, and if white pushes past, then, if white's king has gotten too distracted on the Fursian side, then maybe this knight will jump in to b3 with the idea that, okay, when white takes, black is going to take back and have the chance to push and to make another Fursian. And a light squared Fursian deep in enemy territory here is important because it allows black to come try to mop up these pawns. If black succeeds in promoting on the Shah side, it's probably better to have a second light squared Fursian, and counterintuitive as that may seem, but you want a light squared Fursian that is going to be behind enemy lines to try to pick off the pawns. So that's a lot of strategy, and we'll see how I at least attempted to put some of this to use in this game. Well, what if white doesn't play the e4 break? Well, that's what we see in the game. So white played knight to a4, which is kind of a nothing move, I think. Really just trying to get on with the game. White probably thought that provoking b5 was somehow a good thing because white's going to get the c5 square, but I was going to play b5 anyway because black really does need the space. Okay, the next operation for black here, this knight isn't in the world's greatest square, so I actually reroute it here. This is a maneuver that's seen quite often in Shatranj. Black will put a knight on e7. There'll be an exchange. This f6 pawn is gone, and so suddenly black wants to go back. And often, at least in the endgame, there's time for it. So I played knight to g8. It wasn't the only available option, though. Bringing the knight into b6 and attempting to put more pressure on the Shah side as these pawns march down the board, hoping to get a knight into a4, tickle to b2 square, tickle to c3 square. That was also a very, very interesting way to play. The way that I played was just evenly applying pressure on both sides of the board. So white is, white senses, okay, the knight coming into g4 could be a possibility at some point. So white actually hunkers down, gets ready to play pawn to h3. White has retreated some on this side, so I give chase, and I start trying to advance. Knight to e7, okay, I'm just preparing further maneuvers on the Shah side of the board. So very slowly I am coming up. All right, I've made progress here. I'm going to make progress here. All right, and when I saw pawn to g3, I thought, okay, this Fursian is really going to be hampered in. So I went ahead and created the strong pawn on g4 to essentially completely tie this Fursian down. So h5, king to f3, played here check, exchange, king went back. So black has now made probably the most possible progress that he can make on the Fursian side. It's important to note there are other ways that I could have approached this. Trying to play the move pawn to h4 at some point was another route, particularly if it's paired with bringing a knight into g6 or particularly bringing a knight into f5. The thing that I don't like about playing for the g4 or playing for the h4 break as opposed to g4 is that when black plays h4, white may be able to play g4, fix the pawn on g5 and then bring a knight into f3 and attack the g5 pawn. So the advantage, of course, is just keeping more pawns on the board, more material on the board, less chance of a draw sometimes. But okay, I had 18 seconds. I wasn't going to be messing around with anything that might weaken the g5 pawn too much. Played this plan and just went after this. Okay. All right. First hand to d7. This doesn't look like the world's greatest idea. I don't think that there's a brilliancy prize for this. I guess I'm just coming back in with a knight. Probably since pawn to a5, maybe I didn't want to meet knight b3, maybe hitting this pawn. Maybe I didn't want to play this. Although seems like this would actually be a decent route. Maybe knight to a1 to try to come up this way. Black can probably just play here. Well, yeah. If white plays for the d4 break, well, the king might actually be able to come in. Maybe a little scary to play when you're low on time, but looks like black is actually making some decent headway here. The move d4 is coming. Black is going to run this Fursan in. Black might run the Fursan in. Maybe doesn't even care if white takes and allows a couple of strong pawns in the center. So seems like all right, Fursan to d7, probably just a chicken move for me. Pawn to b3, sure enough, knight to c6. Black doesn't really have to rush, though, in my defense. Black's locked down the Fursan side. Now it's going to try to make some space on the Shah side. So pawn to b4. Okay, logical move here. Because, okay, white wants to take advantage of some of the potential play. Problem with pawn to b4 is that it's a huge target for this elephant to jump in. But here I made a big inaccuracy that Phil really rightly took advantage of and allowed white to immediately turn the game basically into a draw. So I played pawn to d4. First off, it's probably a mistake just because after knight c to e4, black, like let's say that these knights come off. Okay, black isn't getting anywhere with this. Check, just has to go back. So there's really no reason for black to have taken a pair of knights off the board. By taking a pair of knights off the board, black is really reducing his winning chances. With the extra space, that's just what you need to do. You just need to sit on your space edge and push with pawns, but you don't want to trade pieces. So thematically, it's a mistake just for that reason. But the actual reason that it's such a bad move is after Phil played knight e4, black played knight takes e4. Just a move that I had not seen at all. Phil plays d takes e4. And this is really just a kind of a head slapper in that suddenly this elephant is completely free to get back in the game. And also white's space advantage issues are magically fixed because the king can come in, attack the d4 pawn. Black is going to have to exchange. Fursan or elephant is going to get in the game. So very nice find by Phil. And he did he had pre-moved it if you look at the situation. So I love this part of Phil's game in this game is that 4 seconds. I mean, he did this on instinct, and it was a really good fighting instinct. Um, and I'll just show you here. Basically, all right, king to c7, knight to b3. This exchange happened. Bishop d6, and really this game should now just be a draw. But well, yeah. So after king to c7, well, my idea is to come up and and try to make some sort of sacrifice. But if we go back to this position where I played pawn to d4, well, what was the correct plan to try to play for a win? Well, looking at it now, so here's what I see. I see this first hand, it's potentially tied to the defense of the g3 pawn because black always has knight to h5, so it's not going anywhere. This elephant really isn't going anywhere. White isn't well coordinated to try to play the d4 break because black has a little more firepower in the center. So this is stuck. Elephant stuck. King is a little bit towards the first hand side. Black needs to be thinking about breaking on the Shah side then. White has his pieces in the center, sort of. So breaking in the center for black isn't the right move. We're thinking about theory of two fronts. Black's made the front over here. It's already settled. Everything's rock solid. The one weakness is the g3 point. White has to spend some time guarding it. And also White's pieces are kind of tied. This piece is tied to this side of the board. So striking in the center is the wrong way to go. Black needs to try to make a plan on the Shah side. King to c7 strikes me as the right try. It's not clear now how White is going to prevent the sacrifice from taking place. Maybe king to d1. Just trying to get some pieces over there. Bishop to d6. Okay, I'm going to hit this. Now White has to play knight to a2 probably, just to stop this. Okay. So now we've forced White a little bit further back. Knight to b3 is potentially coming up. So this looks like a point when black could break with a5, threatening to crash through on this point on b4. So white has to exchange. It's possible, yeah, I mean, maybe black can try to take it with a king, but that looks too cute. Better play knight takes a5, control these squares. White has to run the king up to c2, probably, to just get some control over these squares. Okay, thinking about this position, what should black play? Well, it's possible now that we've opened up this side of the board a little bit. Possible that a break isn't such a bad idea, but probably just king to b6, keep the pressure. There's no reason to get carried away. White plays knight to b3. Shatranj, so we never exchange pieces. That's the #1 rule of Shatranj, just don't exchange pieces. Probably hop back to c6. If White ever tries this d4 break, the black knight is going to come into e4, and this creates a big problem for White in terms of the pawns that are fixed. The pawn's fixed on g3, and the first hand has to defend it, but pawn to d4 immediately. Black can probably just exchange and then jump a knight in. It's a huge problem for white. So, and of course the e4 break isn't possible because black has that square well controlled. So maybe knight to c3 would be the move. Just really trying to keep the pieces in the game. Black has a few things to calculate. He can calculate the d4 move. Again, these end games, black really has to put the pressure on to make a squeeze. There's no easy win, but statistically, black is going to win a lot of these games. I think maybe the idea now should be thinking about this f3 point that's weak. We've noticed all of white's pieces, they used to be on the Shah side and in the center, or sorry, on the Fursian side and in the center. Now they've progressed over to the Shah side. So it's possible that the correct idea is now going to be to try to execute a maneuver like this, bringing this knight around. Not winning for black, but this is certainly a comfortable game for black. Black just has to keep pushing and pushing and trying to see if he can make something of this. And this is how a lot of these endgames go. So I think turning the attention to the f3 point would be the next big idea. It's possible at some point, that black's going to play e4. The idea being, okay, if d4, then there's a good outpost here. Probably doesn't want to do it when white can just jump in to c5. And often, black might play a break like this and white just ignores it, saying, well, if you take me, I can activate my my bishop. So this is probably the way that black should have played. Would have allowed me to continue to put pressure on white. But the move that I played in the game was really just allowing kind of this immediate equalizing idea. It just solves all of white's problems for him. King to c7, so I'm really just hoping to present one last problem for white. It's probably not such a big problem. Maybe just king to d3 is probably the right move here. So obviously white exchanges, bishop d6 now, king to c3, white holds everything. But okay. If I were to play bishop to d6 here, maybe now, just exchange. Black plays here, white knight comes into b3. This pawn on e5 falls, so black can carry out his plan, but doesn't really do anything useful. White can also just take here, take this next move. So, pawn takes probably isn't the strongest move. But okay, if knight takes, really white should be able to hold the draw pretty easily here. Black's no longer threatening to take on b4. It's okay. White can just kick the knight out, something like that. Knight to c6, king to c3, hold the b4 pawn. White should be able to make a draw here pretty easily. I think king to d3 was the right move. Phil kind of gave me one last chance by playing knight to b3 first. Okay, I get in this exchange because, of course, bishop to d6. Oh, it looks like I have a challenge. I'm not going to do that right now, though. So this exchange, as we've seen, that doesn't get black anything. So knight to b3. in terms of move order accuracy, though, I get just a little bit of something because I'm able to throw in D takes myself. It comes with tempo, so white takes, and then I was able to play bishop to d6. So I'm surrounding the b4 pawn. And Phil came up with a very, very clever move, and it worked perfectly for his purposes in this game. If I'd played a little more accurately, I could have probably taken advantage of it. So well, what should white do? For real in this position. I mean, maybe knight to a5 is the right move. The idea is just to trade this off. So okay, bishop takes b4, knight takes c6, and white's going to be fine. If we see this exchange, black really, if you look at the material that's on the board without a knight, it's very hard for this pawn to fall. This king comes up, this king defends, king to c5, king to c3. There's probably a little something here for black, but not really. Bishop comes to d3, guards a b5 square. This is looking just like a fortress position. So if pawn to b4 first, is maybe an option. White, if white plays the exchange. So here, this doesn't get white anything, just as we've seen, or it doesn't get black anything. Maybe the king comes into b5 as a possibility. So the idea being, after king to c3, now black takes this. After white inserts the bishop check, black plays king takes a5. This is still, probably 100% a draw. This doesn't strike, the extra pawn doesn't strike me as anything winnable here. When we're talking about opposite colored Furzians and all elephants on the board, all pieces that can't take each other at all. Doesn't seem like there's any kind of good break on this side. There's probably no way to get through the center with this Furzan and this pawn and the king sitting here. So there's probably like absolutely nothing here for black, but it's kind of fun to try. So knight to a5 is possible. Maybe white can play king to d3 and try to play for this, but this probably gives a little bit more of a practical winning chance for black. At least you have two connected passers, so there's some prospect of making progress. Certainly not clear, by any means that this is a win. Probably isn't, but knight to c5 it gives me just a little bit of a chance to play for something, and I played pawn to a5, which continue. I played it pretty much instantly, and that just levels the game out to a draw after b takes a5. So the trick with knight to c5 and what Phil saw that's very clever is after bishop takes, white will play knight takes check and then drop the knight back and capture that way, just equalizing the game. So what should black play here? Well, actually my best chance, if I throw in bishop to c4 first, then I'm guarding the a6 pawn. So after king to d3, now black can play bishop takes, knight takes, king to c3. Probably not knight to not to a2. I mean, yeah, maybe, why not? But probably black plays knight to c6. And here black has some winning chances because, okay, black probably, after defending the first hand, getting it to a square where it's nice and defended, black can play king to b6 and start trying to run these pawns down the board. Probably to prevent this, white's going to end up sacrificing an elephant for one of these pawns, and then trying to set up a fortress position. But this looks somewhat more tricky to do, particularly given the time control. So if I'd thrown in bishop to c4 check, I would have had some winning chances. But okay, instead I played pawn to a5. Well, we just see the exchange, king to d3. I play knight to c4. It's actually interesting to note that the white knight is trapped here. So king to c6 was a perfectly valid move. Knight to a6 would be a blunder because then king to b6 and the elephant and king work in tandem to trap this knight. And of course, the knight can't drop back. So king to c6 was actually a cute little trick that I probably should have gone for. Now, how does white save this position? Well, just first hand. Just first hand to d4. Takes. And this position also, black gets a psychological victory maybe from having won the first hand. And who knows? Maybe white will drop more material. The knight might go back to, well, even knight d3 guards this. But maybe if the knight leaves at some moment, there could be a cute fork. But no, really, just this position. There's no good way for black to really continue here. It'd have to be maybe something like knight to c4, and this really should just be a draw. White can play knight d3, knight e5, maybe put a little pressure on the pawns, and the a center pawn versus a first hand, that's not that big a difference. So king to c6 was probably my last practical chance, but if white finds first hand to d4, then there's not really any hope. Knight to c4, again, this position looks good for black, but at this point it's just a fortress. Never exchange pieces in shotrange. If I felt like I could keep pushing for a win, I probably would have moved the knight away, but at this point I was content to go ahead. And I figured this would be a draw, but we see I did want to make sure, so I played a bunch of just non-moves. Black played a huge number of non-moves here in order to rack up, get like 30 seconds on the clock to try to think about the position. But there's no breakthrough. The position looks impressive, but without a knight or something like that to drive away the white king, there's no way for me to break through. And in fact, the end of the game is kind of funny. All right, I threw in this cute elephant move, but this isn't gonna, that's not gonna happen. White's not gonna fall for that. So yeah, the ending of this game is really funny. I bring the king to a4, it does nothing. So we actually get here, and the game was over, draw by threefold repetition, which I hadn't intended. The 3 repetitions of the position are many moves apart, but clearly it is a draw. There's no way that black can break through the fortress. Okay, so Just to do a very quick recap of that game, so that you know what the key takeaway points are. In this structure, okay, probably not good for black to waste several moves and not have focused on development at all, because at this critical point, right here, white should have played e4. Doing it then and then jumping the knight into e5 or d5 would give some advantage. So that's probably big point number one. Point number two, this bishop on e6 isn't really the greatest. Black probably should have just played the rook lift, so that the Furzian could come into e6, and so I struggled a little bit in the middle game, and we took off all of the rooks. Point number three, this endgame, if you have the patience to try to grind it out, can be really a good set of ideas to just add to your repertoire. You should be able to play these positions in Shatranj, with either side. Of course, if you're an e4 player and you get your pawns to e4 very, very early, you probably won't have a lot of these with the weaker side, that's pawns on d3 and e3. But you will have plenty of games where you are the stronger side and you've pushed in the center. So idea number one, advance on the Furzian side, maybe lock down some pieces. Idea number two, try to tackle the Shah side, and then just be careful. A break in the center that's a little too early, and particularly with the opportunity to exchange pieces, is going to give white an easy out for a draw. When you have the stronger side, you want to keep pieces on the board, and you want to play something that's going to keep a certain degree of tension in the position, and you want to keep these pieces on. Probably not e4 there, but this would be the position for black to try to make some advantage out of. Okay, so I hope you've enjoyed that, and we will continue in the next game with more strategy and the same opening set.